The morning Detective Isolde Maren found the blood-stained photograph tucked beneath her windshield wiper. She knew the Boudreaux case had finally come for her. 20 years of silence shattered like glass against concrete as she held the faded image, a young woman's face, smiling at a church picnic, unaware that this moment would be frozen forever as evidence in her own murder. The photo trembled in Isolde's weathered hands, morning dew mixing with something that might have been tears if she still allowed herself that luxury. St. Martinville had always been a town that kept its secrets buried deep in the Louisiana bayou, where Spanish moss draped the truth like funeral shrouds, and the living learned early to let the dead rest. But Amelia Boudreaux had never rested, not in the minds of those who loved her, and certainly not in the filing cabinet of the St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office, where her case file had grown thick with dead ends and false leads over 2 decades. Isolde's coffee had gone cold on the hood of her patrol car as she studied the photograph. Someone had written across the back in blue ink, the writing faded but still legible. She trusted the wrong person, so did you. The words sent ice through her veins because she recognized the handwriting, careful, controlled cursive that belonged to someone who had attended the same Catholic school where the nuns taught penmanship with wooden rulers and unbending discipline. The parking lot of the sheriff's office was empty except for her Crown Victoria and Deputy Marcus Thibodaux's pickup truck. Marcus had been her partner for 7 years, ever since she'd transferred back to St. Martinville from New Orleans, carrying her own collection of ghosts and a reputation for solving cases that other detectives had written off as hopeless. He was the only person who knew why she'd really come home, not for the slower pace or the familiar faces, but because Amelia Boudreaux's killer had never been caught, and some wounds refuse to heal until justice cauterizes them closed. The screen door of Boudreaux's cafe creaked open across the street, and Mrs. Evangeline Boudreaux emerged with a broom, beginning her morning ritual of sweeping the sidewalk. Even at 78, Amelia's grandmother moved with the precision of someone who had learned that routine could hold grief at bay. She wore the same black dress she'd worn to every public appearance since her granddaughter's funeral, and her silver hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to hold her entire composure in place. Isolde watched the old woman sweep, each stroke methodical and purposeful, and remembered the promise she'd made at Amelia's funeral. She had been 25 then, fresh out of the police academy and assigned to crowd control at the service. The entire town had turned out. 500 people packed into St. Martin de Tours Catholic Church, spilling out onto the steps and into the street. Father Broussard had spoken about justice and mercy, but his words had felt hollow against the weight of unanswered questions. That day, as they lowered Amelia's casket into the ground of the old cemetery, where generations of Boudreaux family members rested beneath moss-covered tombstones, Isolde had caught Mrs. Evangeline's eye. The old woman had looked at her with such fierce hope that it had taken Isolde's breath away. Without speaking, she had nodded, a promise made in the language of shared understanding that transcends words. She would find the truth. She would bring Amelia home.
Now, 20 years later, that promise felt heavier than the badge on her chest. The photograph in her hands suggested that someone else knew about that silent vow, someone who had been watching, waiting, planning. The question was whether they intended to help her keep it or ensure she never could. Marcus's boots clicked against the asphalt as he approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the gas station next door. At 45, he was 3 years older than Isolde, but moved with the easy confidence of someone who had never left home, never questioned whether he belonged in the place where he was born. His Cajun accent was soft but unmistakable, especially in the mornings when sleep still clung to his words like Spanish moss to cypress branches. "You look like you seen a ghost, Cher," he said, handing her the coffee. The endearment was casual. He called everyone Cher, from his 80-year-old mother to the teenagers who loitered outside the Dairy Queen, but there was concern in his dark eyes as he took in her expression. "Maybe I have," Isolde said, showing him the photograph. "Found this on my car this morning." Marcus whistled low, a sound like wind through reeds. He had been a junior deputy when Amelia died, assigned to traffic detail and paperwork while the senior investigators worked the case. But he remembered the aftermath, the way the town had held its breath for months, waiting for an arrest that never came. The way people started looking at their neighbors with suspicious eyes, wondering who among them could be capable of such violence. "That's Amelia Boudreaux," he said, though they both knew he didn't need to identify her. Every person in St. Martinville could recognize that face, those bright eyes that had once lit up the church choir and the high school drama club. "Where you think this came from?" "Someone who knows more than they've been saying," Isolde replied, turning the photo over again to study the handwriting. "Question is, why they're speaking up now." The morning sun was climbing higher, burning off the mist that rose from the bayou like the souls of the restless dead. Across the street, Mrs. Evangeline had finished her sweeping and disappeared back inside the cafe, but Isolde could see her silhouette through the window, moving with the same measured precision as she prepared for the morning rush that would bring familiar faces and carefully avoided conversations. The cafe had been Amelia's favorite place, not just because her grandmother ran it, but because it sat at the heart of everything that mattered in St. Martinville. The tourists came for the history, drawn by the legend of Evangeline and the romance of Acadian exile. But the real stories were told over coffee and beignets, in the spaces between words where truth lived, like pearls hidden in oyster shells. "You ever wonder why nobody talks about her anymore?" Isolde asked, watching the morning light catch the surface of the bayou beyond the town square. 20 years ago, everyone had a theory. Everyone knew someone who knew something. Now, it's like she never existed. Marcus sipped his coffee, considering her words. He said, "Maybe they decided it was easier to forget than to keep hoping."
But Isolde knew it was more than that. She had spent 2 decades studying this town, understanding its rhythms and patterns, learning to read the silences that fell over conversations when certain names were mentioned. St. Martinville was a place where families had known each other for generations, where secrets were currency, and loyalty was measured in what you chose not to say. Someone had murdered Amelia Boudreaux on a warm September night in 2004, and that someone was still here, still breathing the same air, still sitting in the same pews at Sunday Mass. They had watched the investigation unfold, had maybe even participated in the search parties that scoured the swamps for evidence. They had attended the vigils and signed the condolence cards and brought covered dishes to the Boudreaux family. And now, 20 years later, they had left a photograph on Isolde's windshield with a message that suggested the game was about to begin again. The radio in Isolde's patrol car crackled to life, dispatching units to a domestic disturbance on the north side of town. Normal life continuing its relentless march, as if the past were just a story told to children to make them behave. But Isolde knew better. The past was alive in this town, lurking beneath the surface, like alligators in still water, patient and deadly, and waiting for the right moment to strike. She tucked the photograph into her jacket pocket, feeling its weight against her heart like a talisman. Mrs. Evangeline was watching from the cafe window, her face a mask of composed grief that had become as much a part of the town's landscape as the ancient oak trees that lined Main Street. Their eyes met across the distance, and the old woman raised her hand in a slight wave, not greeting, but acknowledgement. She had seen the photograph being examined, had perhaps been watching for this moment longer than anyone realized. "What do you want to do about this?" Marcus asked, nodding toward her pocket where the photo rested. Start over, Isolde said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Pull the files, re-interview everyone who's still alive to be interviewed. Someone left me this picture for a reason, and I'm going to find out what that reason is. The morning was warming up, promising another scorching Louisiana day where the humidity wrapped around you like a wet blanket and the air conditioner in the office would struggle to keep pace. But Isolde felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in years, as if the photograph had awakened something that had been sleeping too long. 20 years was a long time to wait for justice, but it was also a long time for guilt to ferment, for secrets to become unbearable burdens, for the truth to demand its day in court. Someone in St. Martinville knew what had happened to Amelia Boudreaux, and they had just announced their readiness to talk. The question now was whether Isolde was ready to listen, and whether she was prepared for what that conversation might cost. Not just her, but everyone in this small town who had learned to live with murder among them, as familiar and unwelcome as the Louisiana heat. The St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office occupied a converted antebellum mansion on the edge of town, its white columns and wraparound porches a testament to a past that seemed increasingly at odds with the reality of modern law enforcement. Isolde's desk sat in what had once been a parlor, beneath a chandelier that had witnessed conversations in French, English, and Spanish over the course of 2 centuries. The walls were painted institutional green, but sometimes in the late afternoon light, she could imagine the room as it had been, filled with music and laughter and the kind of casual elegance that had died with the old Louisiana.
She had spread Amelia Boudreaux's case files across her desk like tarot cards. Each document a piece of a puzzle that had frustrated 3 different generations of investigators. 20 years of accumulated evidence, witness statements, crime scene photographs, forensic reports that had been cutting edge in 2004 but seemed primitive now. DNA analysis that had been inconclusive then might yield different results with today's technology, but the evidence had been compromised by time, humidity, and the inevitable degradation that came with storage in a building that predated modern climate control. The official story was simple enough. On September 23, 2004, 23-year-old Amelia Boudreaux had left her grandmother's cafe at closing time, around 9:30 in the evening. She had been planning to meet friends at a bar in Lafayette, a 30-minute drive north on Highway 31. Her car, a red Honda Civic that her grandmother had helped her buy for her 21st birthday, had been found the next morning in the parking lot of the Evangeline Oak, the massive tree that drew tourists to hear the legend of the Acadian lovers separated by exile and war. Amelia's body had been discovered 3 days later by a fisherman checking his traps in a remote section of the Atchafalaya Basin, nearly 20 miles from where her car had been abandoned. The coroner had determined that she had died from blunt force trauma to the head, but the body's condition and the time spent in the swamp had made it impossible to determine much more. There had been no signs of sexual assault, no clear robbery motive. Her purse had been found in the car with her wallet and cash intact. The investigation had focused initially on her ex-boyfriend, David Hebert, who had been seen arguing with her at the cafe earlier that day. But his alibi had been solid. He had been at work at the oil refinery in Baton Rouge with security cameras and punch card records to prove it. The inquiry had then turned to random violence, the possibility that she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a victim of some drifter passing through town. But Isolde had never believed in random violence, not in a place like St. Martinville, where strangers stood out like oil slicks on water. Someone known and trusted had lured Amelia away from safety, had convinced her to leave her car at the Evangeline Oak, had killed her and dumped her body in the swamp with the casual efficiency of someone who knew the area intimately. The coffee in her cup had grown cold again as she read through the witness statements, looking for patterns and contradictions she might have missed in previous reviews. Mrs. Evangeline had been the last person to see her granddaughter alive, watching from the cafe window as Amelia walked to her car and drove away with a wave and a smile. Father Broussard had seen the Honda Civic parked at the oak tree around 11 o'clock when he drove past on his way home from visiting a parishioner in the hospital. The bartender at Café des Amis in Brobridge had confirmed that Amelia's friends had waited for her until midnight before giving up and going home. Somewhere in those 3 hours between leaving the cafe and failing to arrive at her destination, Amelia Boudreaux had encountered her killer. Isolde's phone rang, interrupting her review of the files. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably local. An older man with an accent thick as a roux and twice as rich. "Detective Maren, this is Titus Guidry. I hear you've been asking questions about the Boudreaux girl." She knew the name, if not the voice. Titus Guidry owned a fishing charter business and had been one of the volunteers who helped search the swamps after Amelia disappeared. His statement from 2004 had been brief and seemingly irrelevant. He had been out on the water the night she died, guiding a group of tourists on a sunset cruise, and had seen nothing unusual.
"Mr. Guidry," she said, pulling his statement from the file, "what can I do for you?" "Might be what I can do for you," he replied. "That picture you've been showing around, the one somebody left on your car, I think maybe it's time we talked." The line went quiet except for the sound of water lapping against boat hulls and the distant cry of gulls. Isolde could picture him at the marina, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the weathered men who made their living from the bayou. These were people who understood the value of silence, who knew that some secrets were worth keeping and others would eat you alive from the inside. "Where do you want to meet?" she asked. "My boat, Pier 7 at the marina. Come alone, and detective, bring that picture with you." The marina sat at the confluence of Bayou Teche and a dozen smaller waterways, a maze of channels and marshland that stretched south toward the Gulf of Mexico. It was a place where the modern world gave way to something older and more primal, where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred like watercolors in the rain. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like tattered curtains, and the air was thick with the smell of mud and fish and the green growing things that flourished in the humid heat. Titus Guidry's boat was a 30-foot aluminum craft designed for shallow water navigation, equipped with an airboat fan and a flat bottom that could skim over sandbars and through passages barely wider than the beam. He was waiting on the dock, a man in his 70s with skin like leather and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore the uniform of his profession, khaki work shirt, oil-stained jeans, and rubber boots that had seen decades of bayou mud. "You look like your daddy," he said as she approached, which surprised her because she hadn't known that he knew her family. "Claude Maren was a good man, died too young." "You knew my father?" "Worked with him some, back when he ran that salvage operation out of Morgan City, before you was born probably. He used to say his little girl was going to be something special." Titus gestured toward his boat. "Come on aboard. What I got to show you ain't for public consumption." The line guided them away from the marina and into the main channel of the bayou, past weekend fishermen and pleasure boats filled with tourists eager for a glimpse of authentic Louisiana culture. "You know why they call this place the heart of Acadania?" he asked as they traveled deeper into the marsh. "It's because this is where the Acadians came when they got kicked out of Nova Scotia, lost everything, their homes, their families, their whole way of life. But they survived, they adapted, they made something new out of what was left." Isolde knew the history, had grown up with the stories of exile and perseverance that formed the backbone of local identity. But she sensed that Titus was building towards something more personal, more immediate than historical context. They traveled for nearly 20 minutes before he cut the engine and allowed the boat to drift into a small cove surrounded by cypress trees. The silence was absolute except for the sound of water against the hull and the distant splash of something large disappearing beneath the surface. This is where they found her, Amelia, right over there by that dead tree. I was the one guided the search team out here. Isolde felt a chill despite the heat. She had read the location in the files, had studied the crime scene photographs, but being here in person made it real in a way that paperwork never could. This was where a young woman's life ended, where someone thought the swamp would keep their secrets forever. "Where do you want to meet?" she asked. "My boat, Pier 7 at the marina. Come alone, and detective, bring that picture with you." He reached into a cooler and pulled out a beer, offering her one that she declined. His hands shook slightly as he opened the can. Not from age, she realized, but from nerves. 20 years I've been carrying this around," he said. 20 years I've been telling myself it wasn't important, that it wouldn't change nothing. But when I heard you was looking at the case again, when I heard about that picture—" He took a long drink of beer and stared out over the water. Maybe it's time to quit being a coward. What did you see, Mr. Guidry? That night, September 23rd, I was out here with a charter. 4 guys from Houston wanted to see the real Louisiana. We was heading back to the marina around midnight when I seen lights out here in the cove. Thought it might be night fishermen, but something felt wrong about it. He paused, gathering his thoughts, or perhaps his courage. A great blue heron landed on a nearby cypress branch, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it too were listening to his story. I got curious, so I cut my engine and drifted closer. There was 2 boats. One was a John boat with a trolling motor, the kind anybody around here might use for fishing or checking traps. The other, he looked directly at Isolde for the first time since they'd left the marina. The other was a sheriff's department boat. The words hit her like a physical blow. A sheriff's department boat at the scene where Amelia's body would be found 3 days later, at midnight, on the night she died. The implications were staggering, the possibilities too terrible to fully process. You're sure it was a department boat? Had the light bar on top, the county seal on the side. I know every boat on this bayou, detective. That was one of ours. Did you see who was on it? Too dark, and I was too far away to make out faces, but I seen them pulling something out of the water, something heavy that took both of them to handle. They loaded it into the John boat, then the department boat headed back toward town. Isolde's mind raced through the implications. If Titus was telling the truth, then someone in law enforcement had been present at the disposal site on the night of the murder. Not just present, actively involved in dumping evidence or possibly the body itself. Why didn't you report this in 2004? Titus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Report what to who? That I seen a sheriff's boat in the bayou at night? Half the department uses them boats for legitimate business. I didn't know then that anybody was dead. Hell, I didn't even know the girl was missing until the next day. But after her body was found, I was scared, he admitted. If someone in the department was involved, who was I gonna tell? The sheriff? The state police? And say what? That I maybe seen something that might have been important but couldn't identify anybody? The heron took flight, its wings barely disturbing the still air as it disappeared into the canopy above. Isolde watched it go, trying to process what she had learned and what it meant for the investigation she thought she understood. The picture on your car, that was you being warned. Someone knows you're getting close to something they want to stay buried, and if they're willing to warn you, they might be willing to do worse.
The boat drifted in the current, rotating slowly until Isolde was facing the spot where Amelia's body had been found. 20 years later, it looked peaceful, just another bend in the bayou where fish jumped and birds nested, and the cycle of life continued without regard for human tragedy. But now she knew it was something else, a crime scene that had been staged, a cover-up that reached into the very institution she served. Mr. Guidry, I need you to make an official statement. Come to the office, go on record with what you saw. And if the person who killed that girl is wearing a badge, if he's the one taking my statement? It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of every small-town department, where everybody knew everybody, and loyalty ran deeper than professional obligation. If someone in the sheriff's office had been involved in Amelia's murder, then the entire investigation had been compromised from the beginning. Then we'll go to the state police, Isolde said. or the FBI. But we can't let this die with us, Mr. Guidry. Amelia deserves better than that." He finished his beer and tossed the empty can into a plastic bag, the automatic gesture of someone who had spent his life on the water and understood the importance of leaving no trace. When he looked at her again, his storm cloud eyes were hard with determination. "All right, detective, I'll come in tomorrow morning, but you better be damn sure you know what you're doing, because once this gets out, there's no putting it back in the bottle." The trip back to the marina was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The revelation changed everything, not just about the case, but about her own position within the investigation. If someone in the department was involved in Amelia's murder, then the entire investigation had been compromised from the beginning. As they approached the dock, Isolde's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging or join her in the swamp." She showed it to Titus, who read it and shook his head grimly. "Like I said, detective, someone's been watching you. Question now is what you gonna do about it." The next morning brought news that made Isolde's blood run cold. Marcus found her at her desk before dawn, his face grim with the kind of exhaustion that came from being awakened by tragedy in the small hours. "Titus Guidry's boat caught fire last night. Total loss. Coast Guard's calling it suspicious." The coffee cup slipped from Isolde's hands, sending hot liquid across the Boudreaux case files. She grabbed paper towels, dabbing frantically at the spreading stain while her mind processed the implications. Less than 12 hours after agreeing to give an official statement about what he'd seen the night Amelia died, Titus Guidry's livelihood had gone up in flames. Is he hurt? Shaken up, but okay. Fire started around 2 in the morning. He was at home, got a call from another fisherman who's seen the glow. By the time the fire department got there, wasn't nothing left but the hull and some melted metal. Isolde looked at the ruined files, the photographs of Amelia's crime scene now stained with coffee like old blood. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Evidence being destroyed, witnesses being silenced, the past literally going up in smoke before her eyes. "This isn't a coincidence," she said. "I figured you might say that," Marcus replied,
settling into the chair beside her desk. "Question is, what you gonna do about it?" The question hung in the air between them like humidity before a storm. In the 24 hours since finding the photograph on her windshield, Isolde had learned that someone in law enforcement might have been involved in Amelia's murder, that witnesses were being intimidated, and that her own investigation was being monitored by people with the resources and motivation to stop it. Sheriff Raymond Boudreaux, no relation to the victim despite the shared name, arrived at the office an hour later, his presence filling the converted mansion like the scent of expensive cologne and old political connections. At 62, he was in his 4th term as sheriff, elected repeatedly on a platform of traditional values and keeping St. Martinville safe from the changes that had transformed other Louisiana parishes. He was a big man, with silver hair and the kind of smile that had won him votes but never quite reached his eyes. "Isolde," he said, settling into the chair that Marcus had vacated at his approach. "Heard you've been stirring up some old cases. The Boudreaux girl." It wasn't a question, which told her that her activities were being reported to the sheriff by someone, possibly multiple someones, within the department. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and heavy and impossible to ignore. "Just following up on some new information, Sheriff." "What kind of new information?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than she'd expected. She could tell him about the photograph, about Titus Guidry's account of seeing a sheriff's department boat at the crime scene, about the threatening text message and the convenient fire that had destroyed a potential witness's ability to make a living. Or she could lie, deflect, buy herself time to figure out who could be trusted and who might be working to cover up a 20-year-old murder. "Anonymous tip," she said finally. "Probably nothing, but you know how it is with cold cases. Sometimes old witnesses remember things differently." Sheriff Boudreaux studied her face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades reading people, separating truth from fiction, loyalty from betrayal. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair in a rhythm that reminded her of rain on a tin roof. Steady, persistent, impossible to ignore. "You know I was a deputy when that girl died. Worked that case myself alongside Detective Trosclair and Sergeant Arsenault. We turned this parish upside down looking for her killer. Followed every lead, interviewed every person who might have known something. Came up empty-handed." Cases get solved 20 years later all the time. New technology, new witnesses coming forward, old evidence getting re-examined with fresh eyes. "That's true," he agreed. "But sometimes old evidence gets re-examined by people who don't understand the context, don't know the history. Sometimes fresh eyes see patterns that aren't there, connections that don't exist." There was a warning in his words, subtle but unmistakable. He was telling her to be careful, to remember her place, to consider the consequences of pursuing a case that powerful people had considered closed. But there was something else, too, a defensiveness that suggested he knew more about the investigation's failures than he was admitting. "I understand the sensitivity. A young woman murdered, family never getting closure, community losing faith in law enforcement. But if there's new evidence, it needs to be handled properly, through proper channels, with proper oversight." He leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "Isolde, you're a good detective, one of the best we've had in this department. But this case destroyed careers. Detective Trosclair retired early because of it. Sergeant Arsenault transferred to Lafayette because he couldn't handle the pressure. You sure you want to risk what you've built here?"
The threat was no longer subtle. He was telling her that pursuing the Boudreaux case would end her career in St. Martinville, that she would follow the same path as the previous investigators, forced out, discredited, carrying the weight of failure like a millstone around her neck. "I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but I took an oath when I became a police officer, to protect and serve, to seek justice for victims and their families. Amelia Boudreaux deserves that justice, even if it takes 20 years to get it." Sheriff Boudreaux stood up, smoothing his uniform with hands that shook slightly, not from age, Isolde realized, but from anger barely held in check. When he looked at her again, the political smile was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Detective Maren, I'm officially reassigning you from cold case review to traffic enforcement, effective immediately. All case files are to be returned to the evidence room, all witness interviews suspended. Is that clear?" "Crystal," Isolde said, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Being reassigned to traffic duty was department code for professional exile, a punishment reserved for officers who had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. After he left, the office felt smaller, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in with each breath. Isolde sat at her desk, staring at the coffee-stained files that contained 20 years of unanswered questions, feeling the weight of institutional power pressing down on her like water at the bottom of the bayou. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. "Good girl, keep being smart." But instead of fear, Isolde felt something else building inside her chest, a cold, clean anger that burned like alcohol poured on an open wound. Someone thought they could intimidate her into silence, could threaten her career and her safety to protect a secret that had already destroyed too many lives. They were about to learn that some people couldn't be bought, threatened, or scared away from the truth. She gathered the files and walked to the evidence room where Deputy Angela Tran was cataloging items from a recent drug bust. Angela was 32, a former Marine who had joined the department 3 years earlier after finishing her criminal justice degree at LSU. She was also one of the few people in the office who hadn't grown up in St. Martinville, which meant her loyalties weren't complicated by family connections and childhood friendships. "Hey, Angela," Isolde said casually, "I need a favor." "Shoot!" "I'm being reassigned, so I need to return these files, but I was wondering if you could make copies of everything first. Unofficial copies, for my own reference." Angela looked at the Boudreaux files, then at Isolde's face, reading the tension and determination there. She had been around long enough to know that official reassignment sometimes had unofficial reasons, that politics and policing didn't always align with justice. How unofficial are we talking?
The kind that never happened. The kind that doesn't exist if anyone asks. And if someone finds out, then I take the heat, alone. Angela considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Give me an hour. I'll scan everything and put it on a thumb drive. But Isolde, be careful. Whatever you're digging into, it's got people nervous." "How do you know?" "Because Sheriff Boudreaux spent 20 minutes in the evidence room yesterday, looking through boxes that haven't been touched in years. And when I asked if he needed help, he told me to forget I'd seen him there." The revelation hit Isolde like a slap. The sheriff had been in the evidence room, possibly tampering or removing items related to the Boudreaux case. It suggested not just corruption, but active participation in a cover-up that reached the highest levels of local law enforcement. That afternoon, while officially beginning her new assignment monitoring traffic on Highway 31, Isolde used her patrol car's computer to run background checks on every deputy who'd worked for the department in 2004. What she found painted a picture of an organization under stress, with an unusually high turnover rate in the months following Amelia's murder. Detective Paul Trosclair had retired 6 months after the case went cold, citing health problems. Sergeant Robert Arsenault had transferred to Lafayette Parish a year later, taking a demotion to deputy in order to make the move. Deputy Michael Broussard had left law enforcement entirely, becoming a high school teacher in New Iberia. 3 other officers had resigned or transferred within 2 years of the murder, leaving the department with almost entirely new personnel by 2007. The pattern suggested either massive incompetence or deliberate house cleaning, the removal of officers who might have known too much, seen too much, or asked too many questions about what had really happened to Amelia Boudreaux. Her radio crackled with a call about a domestic disturbance on Levy Road, and Isolde responded automatically, muscle memory taking over while her mind continued processing what she had learned. The domestic turned out to be a neighbor complaint about loud music, easily resolved with a warning and a request to keep the volume down. But as she was walking back to her patrol car, she noticed another vehicle pulling up behind hers, a black pickup truck with tinted windows and no front license plate. The driver didn't get out, didn't identify himself, just sat there with the engine running while she completed her paperwork. When she pulled away from the scene, the truck followed her, not close enough to be obvious, not far enough to be coincidental. It stayed with her through 3 more traffic stops, maintaining the same distance, making the same turns, disappearing only when she returned to the sheriff's office at the end of her shift. That evening, Isolde drove to her small house on the outskirts of town, a shotgun-style cottage that had belonged to her grandmother and still smelled faintly of lavender sachets the old woman had kept in every drawer. The house sat on 2 acres of land that backed up to a cypress swamp, providing privacy and isolation that once felt like sanctuary but now seemed dangerously exposed. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance among the Spanish moss while her mind worked through the day's revelations. The sheriff's behavior, the pattern of departures from the department, the surveillance that was becoming increasingly obvious, all of it pointed to a conspiracy that had been 20 years in the making.
Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Isolde felt a familiar twist of guilt for not calling more often, not visiting more regularly, not being the daughter that Marie Maren deserved after losing her husband so young. "Cher, I've been hearing things," her mother said without preamble. Marie had never been one for small talk, preferring to address problems head-on with the directness of someone who had raised a daughter alone while working 2 jobs and keeping food on the table. "What kind of things, Mama?" "That you've been asking questions about that poor Boudreaux girl, that some people ain't happy about it." Isolde closed her eyes, wondering how news traveled so fast in a town where everybody claimed to mind their own business. "Who's been talking to you?" "Don't matter who. What matters is that my daughter might be putting herself in danger for something that happened before she was even assigned to this parish." It was true. Isolde had been working in New Orleans when Amelia died, dealing with her own cases and her own demons in a city where murder was so common it barely made the news, unless the victim was wealthy or white, or both. She had come to St. Martinville 7 years later, officially for a quieter life, but really because she had needed to escape the memories of her former partner's death and her own role in the shooting that had ended his life. "Mama, sometimes doing the right thing means accepting some risk. And sometimes doing the right thing means knowing when to walk away. Your daddy never learned that lesson, and look what it got him." The words stung because they contained enough truth to draw blood. Claude Maren had died in an industrial accident when Isolde was 15, crushed beneath a piece of salvage equipment he had been trying to repair instead of replace. He had been trying to save money, to provide for his family, to solve a problem that wasn't really his to solve. The parallels to her current situation were uncomfortably obvious. "This is different, Mama." "Is it? You think whoever killed that girl won't kill you too if you get too close? You think 20 years of getting away with murder makes people less dangerous or more?" After her mother hung up, Isolde sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds of the swamp and trying to convince herself that she wasn't being reckless, that the similarities to her father's fate were coincidental rather than prophetic. But doubt crept in, like fog off the bayou, cold and clammy and impossible to shake. Around midnight, she was awakened by the sound of her dogs barking frantically in the backyard. She kept 2 German shepherds, Rex and Duchess, partly for companionship, but mostly for security in a job that made enemies of people who preferred their business conducted in darkness. The dogs were trained and disciplined, not given to false alarms or midnight paranoia. Isolde grabbed her service weapon and a flashlight, moving quietly through the house toward the back door. Through the window, she could see Rex standing at attention near the edge of the swamp, his body rigid with alertness. Duchess was circling the yard's perimeter, nose to the ground, following a scent trail that led from the tree line toward the house. She stepped on the porch, gun drawn but pointed down, and swept the flashlight beam across the yard. Nothing moved except the dogs, but there was something wrong with the scene, a disturbance in the natural order that set her nerves on edge. Then she saw it. A cross burned into the grass near her driveway, the charred wood still smoldering in the humid night air. It was crude, but effective, a message that needed no translation in a state where such symbols carried the weight of history and the promise of violence. The dogs had found the gasoline can discarded in the bushes near the property line, along with a book of matches from Boudreaux's cafe. The irony of the location wasn't lost on her. Someone was using Amelia's grandmother's business to threaten the person trying to solve her murder. Isolde called the sheriff's office to report the incident, knowing it was probably futile but needing to establish an official record. The dispatcher told her a deputy would be out within the hour, but it was nearly 3 o'clock before anyone arrived. Deputy Tommy Melancon, a 25-year-old rookie who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Probably just kids," he said after taking a perfunctory look at the burned cross. "You know how teenagers are, always looking for ways to cause trouble." "Kids don't usually target specific houses, Tommy. And they don't usually know enough about intimidation tactics to make it this personal. Well, I'll write up a report. Probably won't amount to much, but it'll be on file if anything else happens." After he left, Isolde sat on her porch with the dogs at her feet, watching the eastern sky lighten with the approach of dawn. She was being warned away from the Boudreaux case by people who had the resources to monitor her movements, destroy evidence, and escalate to physical intimidation when other methods failed. The smart thing would be to listen to her mother, to accept the reassignment to traffic duty, to let sleeping dogs lie and focus on cases that wouldn't threaten her career or her safety. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Amelia Boudreaux's photograph, that bright smile frozen in time. And she heard Mrs. Evangeline's voice at the funeral asking, why would God take such a good girl? The next morning brought another development that changed the stakes entirely. Marcus met her at the office with news that made her stomach drop like a stone through still water. State police found a body. Female, early 20s, been in the water for several days. They pulled her out of the Atchafalaya Basin, about 10 miles from where they found Amelia. Who is she? That's the thing. Nobody knows yet. No ID, no missing person reports that match the description. But Isolde. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The injuries are consistent with what happened to Amelia. Blunt force trauma to the head, body dumped in the swamp. The implication hit her like a physical blow. If Marcus was right, then they weren't dealing with a cold case, but with an active serial killer. Someone who had been operating for 20 years, possibly taking victims and disposing of them in the vast expanse of Louisiana wetlands where bodies could disappear forever. Have you told the sheriff? That's where it gets interesting. State police called our office this morning, asked to speak with whoever was handling the Boudreaux case. Sheriff told them the case was closed, that we didn't have anyone actively working it, which meant the state police didn't know about her recent investigation, didn't know about the photograph or Titus Guidry's testimony or the pattern of evidence suggesting official involvement in the cover-up. They were starting from scratch, trying to solve a new murder while missing crucial context that could link it to the old one. I need to call them. As what? A traffic cop with no official jurisdiction over either case?
It was a fair point. Her reassignment meant she had no standing to involve herself in either investigation, no authority to share information or request access to evidence. Officially, she was nobody, just another small-town deputy with delusions of detective work. But unofficially, she was the only person who had been asking the right questions, the only one who had begun to uncover the web of corruption and cover-up that stretched back 20 years. If she walked away now, if she let bureaucracy and intimidation tactics silence her, then both Amelia and this new victim would join the ranks of the forgotten dead. That afternoon, while conducting her assigned traffic enforcement, Isolde made a decision that would either solve a 20-year-old murder or end her career in law enforcement. She called the state police detective handling the new case, a woman named Catherine Broussard who had a reputation for thorough investigation and political independence. Detective Broussard, this is Detective Isolde Maren with St. Martin Parish. I understand you have a body that might be connected to one of our old cases. The John Doe from the basin? What makes you think there's a connection? Because 20 years ago, we had a similar murder with similar disposal methods. And because I've been working the cold case and uncovered some information that might be relevant to your investigation. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the sound of paper shuffling and keyboards clicking. Detective Broussard was checking records, verifying Isolde's credentials, probably wondering why a parish detective was calling about a case that had officially been declared inactive. Detective Maren, according to my contact at your department, the Boudreaux case isn't currently under investigation. Sheriff Boudreaux told me it was closed due to lack of evidence. That's technically correct, but I've been reviewing the files on my own time, and I've uncovered some new information that suggests the original investigation may have been compromised. Another pause, longer this time. When Broussard spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral, the tone of someone who had learned to navigate political minefields without stepping on unexploded ordnance. What kind of information? The kind that should be discussed in person, away from official channels. Can you meet me tonight, somewhere private? Detective Maren, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I'm suggesting that a young woman was murdered 20 years ago, and that someone with access to official resources helped cover it up. I'm suggesting that your current victim might not be the first one since Amelia, just the first one that's been found. And I'm suggesting that if we don't work together, whoever did this is going to keep killing until someone stops them. The line went quiet except for the sound of Detective Broussard's breathing. Isolde could picture her weighing the risks, career damage versus justice, political safety versus moral obligation, the comfortable certainty of official channels versus the dangerous complexity of corruption and conspiracy.
There's a truck stop on I-10, about halfway between Baton Rouge and Lafayette, Broussard said finally. Neutral ground. Meet me there at 9 o'clock tonight, and bring whatever evidence you have. But, Detective, if this turns out to be some kind of jurisdictional game or personal vendetta, I'll make sure your career is over by morning. Understood, Isolde said, though her heart was hammering with relief and terror in equal measure. And, Detective, come armed, because if I'm right about what's been happening, then we're both in danger just for having this conversation. The truck stop squatted beside Interstate 10 like a neon oasis in the Louisiana darkness, its harsh fluorescent lights creating an island of artificial day in the surrounding night. Isolde arrived early, positioning herself at a corner booth where she could watch both entrances and keep her back to the wall. Habits learned from 7 years of investigating cases where the difference between paranoia and survival was often measured in seconds. Detective Catherine Broussard arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, moving through the diner with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to walking into potentially hostile situations. She was younger than Isolde had expected, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they swept the room before settling on her contact. Detective Maren. She slid into the booth across from Isolde, declining the offered handshake in favor of keeping her hands free and visible. You look like someone who hasn't been sleeping well. Hard to sleep when you're being followed, Isolde replied, nodding toward the window where the black pickup truck had just pulled into the parking lot. That's been my shadow for the past 3 days. Question is whether they're here to watch or to act. Broussard glanced at the truck, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon before settling on the table. State police tend to discourage unauthorized surveillance. Should I make a call? Not yet. Let's see what they do. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who probably had been working the night shift since Isolde was born, brought coffee without being asked and retreated to the counter with the wisdom of someone who recognized a law enforcement meeting when she saw one. "Show me what you have," Broussard said. And Isolde spread the copied files across the table, like evidence at trial. The photographs of Amelia's crime scene, the witness statements, the forensic reports, 20 years of investigation reduced to paper and images that told a story of systematic failure and deliberate misdirection. But it was Titus Guidry's account that made Broussard lean forward, her professional skepticism giving way to intense concentration. The story of the Sheriff's Department boat at the disposal site, the two figures transferring something heavy between vessels, the timing that placed law enforcement at the scene on the night of the murder. "This is explosive," Broussard said quietly. "If it's true."
It's true. And there's more. Isolde showed her the photograph that had started everything, the threatening text messages, the pattern of departures from the Sheriff's Department in the months following Amelia's death. Someone's been covering this up for 20 years, and they're willing to kill to keep it covered up. What makes you think the new victim is connected? Same disposal method, same general area, same type of trauma. But more than that, the timing. 3 days after I start asking questions about Amelia, another body turns up in the swamp. That's not coincidence. Broussard studied the crime scene photographs from both cases, comparing injury patterns and disposal locations with the methodical attention of someone trained to see connections that others missed. When she looked up,
Her expression was grim with professional certainty.
You're right. Same killer, same methods. But that means we're not dealing with a single murder from 20 years ago. We're dealing with a serial killer who's been operating under official protection. Or a serial killer who is official protection. The words hung in the air between them like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implication and impossible to take back once spoken. If someone within law enforcement was directly responsible for the murders, then every aspect of both investigations had been compromised from the beginning. "I need to see the new crime scene," Isolde said, "and I need access to the evidence from your victim." "That's not going to be easy. Officially, you have no standing in my investigation, and unofficially, if your department is compromised, then any cooperation between us puts both cases at risk." Through the window, they could see the black pickup truck still idling in the parking lot, its occupant invisible behind tinted glass, but undoubtedly watching their meeting with professional interest. The surveillance was becoming bolder, more obvious, either because they no longer cared about being detected or because they were preparing to escalate beyond mere observation. "There might be another way," Broussard said, pulling out her phone. "I have a contact at the FBI, Special Agent Rebecca Landry. She specializes in cases involving official corruption, and she's been looking for an excuse to investigate some of the parishes around here." FBI involvement means this becomes a federal case. Political pressure, media attention, careers ruined. Some careers deserve to be ruined. And if we're right about what's been happening, then political pressure might be the only thing that forces the truth into the open. Isolde watched the pickup truck through the window, thinking about the choice she was facing. Involving the FBI would mean crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, turning a local investigation into a federal matter with consequences that would ripple through every level of Louisiana politics. But it would also mean protection, for herself, for witnesses like Titus Guidry, for potential future victims. "Make the call," she said.
Broussard dialed a number from memory, speaking quietly into her phone while Isolde continued to monitor the parking lot. The conversation was brief but intense, filled with the kind of coded language that law enforcement used when discussing sensitive matters over potentially monitored lines. "She'll meet us tomorrow morning," Broussard said, hanging up. "Neutral location, unofficial consultation. But she needs more than testimony and circumstantial evidence. She needs something concrete, physical evidence, documentary proof, someone willing to go on record with details that can be corroborated." "What about the new victim? Any identification yet?" "That's where things get interesting. No ID, but we found something else. A business card in her pocket, partially decomposed but still readable. Dr. James Thibodaux, family practice. Address in St. Martinville." The name hit Isolde like a physical blow. Dr. Thibodaux was Marcus's father, a respected physician who had practiced in St. Martinville for 40 years. He had treated half the town, delivered most of the babies born in the past 2 decades, served on the school board and the parish council. He was also someone who would have had access to young women, medical knowledge sufficient to cause specific types of trauma, and the social standing to deflect suspicion. "Jesus," she whispered. "You know him?" "My partner is his son. Dr. Thibodaux he's like the town grandfather. Everyone trusts him. Everyone respects him. If he's involved, then we need to be very careful how we proceed. Men like that don't just have friends. They have political protection, financial resources, the kind of connections that can destroy investigations before they start." As if summoned by their conversation, Isolde's phone buzzed with a call from Marcus. She stared at the screen, wondering what he knew, what he might have seen or heard, whether his loyalty lay with his partner or his father. "Detective Maren, we got a problem. Titus Guidry's missing." The words sent ice through her veins. "What do you mean, missing?" "His truck's at the marina, boat still burned out, but nobody's seen him since yesterday evening. His neighbor says he mentioned going fishing with someone but couldn't say who. Isolde met Bruson's eyes across the table, both of them understanding the implications without need for discussion. Titus Guidry had been the key witness, the one person who could place a sheriff's department boat at the crime scene. Now he was gone, disappeared into the same swampland where Amelia and the new victim had been found. Marcus, I need you to listen to me carefully. Don't discuss this with anyone else in the department. Don't file any reports. Don't tell the sheriff. Can you do that? Isolde, what the hell is going on? I can't explain right now, but I will soon. Just trust me, okay? After she hung up, Broussard was already standing, gathering the files with the efficiency of someone preparing for war. We need to accelerate our timeline. If Guidry's been taken, then someone knows he talked to you, which means they know you're close to the truth. Close enough to be dangerous. Close enough to be dead. They left the diner separately, Isolde waiting 5 minutes before following Broussard toward the parking lot. The black pickup truck started its engine as she emerged, its headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. But instead of following her, it pulled out ahead, disappearing into the night traffic of Interstate 10.
The message was clear. They knew where she was going, what she was doing, who she was talking to. The surveillance had served its purpose, gathering intelligence that would allow them to stay one step ahead of the investigation. During the drive back to St. Martinville, Isolde's phone rang 3 more times. 2 calls from unknown numbers that went to voicemail with no message left, and 1 from her mother that she let go unanswered. The darkness beyond her headlights seemed deeper than usual, filled with shadows that might have been trees or might have been something more dangerous. She arrived home to find her dogs agitated but unharmed, circling the yard with the nervous energy of animals that had sensed threat without being able to identify its source. A quick check of the house revealed nothing obviously disturbed, but there was a wrongness to the atmosphere, the feeling that someone had been there, had moved through her private spaces with casual violation. In her bedroom, she found the violation made manifest. Another photograph on her pillow, this one showing Titus Guidry tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned building. His eyes were wide with terror, and there was blood on his face from injuries that were recent enough to still be wet. On the back, written in the same careful handwriting as before, "Stop now or he dies. You have 24 hours." Isolde sat on her bed, holding the photograph with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. The game had escalated beyond intimidation and threats to kidnapping and torture. Titus Guidry was suffering because he had tried to help her, was facing death because he had finally found the courage to speak the truth. But the photograph also represented a mistake, the first real error that whoever was behind this had made, because it showed a location, architectural details that might be identifiable, maybe even forensic evidence that could be analyzed. It was proof of a crime in progress, evidence that even the most corrupt local investigation couldn't ignore or suppress. She called Broussard, speaking quietly into her phone while walking the perimeter of her property with the dogs at her side. "They have Guidry, and they're threatening to kill him if I don't back off." "Where are you?" "Home, but not for long. They've been inside, left another message. This place isn't safe anymore. Meet me at the state police barracks in Baton Rouge. Bring everything, the files, the photographs, your weapon. We're going federal tonight, and we're going loud. Whoever's behind this just graduated from murder to kidnapping, which means they're desperate enough to make more mistakes." As Isolde packed her evidence and prepared to abandon the home that had been her sanctuary, she thought about Amelia Boudreaux and the promise she had made at a young woman's funeral. 20 years of silence were about to be shattered, and the truth was finally going to demand its day in court. But first, they had to survive long enough to tell it. The FBI field office in New Orleans occupied a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the Louisiana sky like a spear thrown by federal justice. Special Agent Rebecca Landry met them in a conference room on the 20th floor where floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the city sprawling toward Lake Pontchartrain and the Gulf beyond. But Isolde's attention was focused on the evidence spread across the conference table. 20 years of lies finally exposed to the harsh light of federal scrutiny.
Agent Landry was 45, with graying hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that came from decades of unraveling conspiracies that powerful people had spent fortunes trying to hide. She studied each document with methodical precision, asking pointed questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the legal implications and the political dangers of what they were alleging. So we have a murdered witness, a kidnapped informant, photographic evidence of official vehicles at crime scenes, and a pattern of cover-up that reaches the highest levels of local law enforcement, she summarized after reviewing everything. What we don't have is direct evidence linking any specific individual to the actual murders. We have Dr. Thibodaux's business card in the new victim's pocket, Broussard pointed out, which proves contact, not murder. A good defense attorney will argue that she was his patient, that the card means nothing more than a medical relationship. Isolde felt frustration building in her chest like steam in a pressure cooker. After everything they had uncovered, all the risks they had taken, the federal response was still measured, cautious, bound by the same evidentiary requirements that had allowed the killings to continue for 2 decades. "What about Titus Guidry?" she asked. "He's being held somewhere, probably tortured, definitely in immediate danger. Don't we have an obligation to find him?" "We do, and we will. But if we move too fast, too obviously, we risk spooking the kidnappers into killing him before we can locate where he's being held." As if summoned by their conversation, Landry's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered with the crisp professionalism of someone accustomed to crisis management, but her expression grew increasingly grim as she listened to the voice on the other end. "Understood. We'll be there in 2 hours." She hung up and turned to face them with the expression of someone delivering news that would change everything. Titus Guidry has been found, alive but in critical condition. A fisherman discovered him tied to a pier near Breaux Bridge, beaten unconscious but breathing. He's being transported to Our Lady of Lourdes Medical Center in Lafayette. Relief flooded through Isolde like cool water, followed immediately by renewed urgency. If Guidry was alive, he might be able to identify his attackers, provide details about where he had been held, offer the direct testimony that could break the case wide open. "I need to talk to him," she said. "We all do, but first we need to make sure he's protected. If someone was willing to kidnap and torture him to prevent his testimony, they might be willing to finish the job in a hospital room." The drive to Lafayette took them through the heart of Acadiana, past sugar-cane fields and cypress swamps that stretched toward the horizon like green seas under the afternoon sun. Landry rode with them, using the travel time to coordinate with federal prosecutors and arrange for witness protection resources that could keep Guidry alive long enough to testify. At the medical center, they found Guidry sedated but conscious, his weathered face swollen with bruises and his hands bandaged where someone had used pliers on his fingernails. Despite his injuries, his storm cloud eyes were alert and angry, not broken by his ordeal, but hardened by it, transformed from reluctant witness to determined survivor.
"They wanted to know what I told you," he said, his voice hoarse from screaming but still strong with Cajun stubbornness. "Kept asking who else knew about the boat, who else might be willing to talk." "Did you tell them anything?" Landry asked gently. "Told him to go to hell. Told him I was just an old fisherman who didn't know nothing about nothing." A smile ghosted across his battered features. "Don't think they believed me." "Did you see who did this to you?" "Not their faces. They kept masks on the whole time. But I heard voices, recognized accents. Local boys, born and raised. And one of them—" He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "One of them called the other by name. Called him Marcus." The words hit Isolde like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and sending her reeling backward against the hospital room wall. Marcus Thibodaux, her partner, her friend,
The man she had trusted with her life on countless occasions had been one of Guidry's torturers. "You're sure?" she whispered.
"Sure as I'm laying here. Been hearing that boy's voice since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, back when his daddy used to bring him to the marina. That was Marcus Thibodaux, who helped beat me half to death."
The revelation recontextualized everything. Every conversation they had shared about the case, every piece of evidence she had discussed with him, every plan and strategy that had somehow been anticipated by their opponents. Marcus hadn't just been failing to investigate the Boudreaux murder, he had been actively sabotaging the investigation from within. "How long have you suspected?" Landry asked.
"Part of me is known for years," Isolde admitted. "Little things that didn't add up. Coincidences that happened too often, but I told myself I was being paranoid, that working alone for so long had made me suspicious of everyone."
"What about his father, Dr. Thibodaux?"
"Has to be involved. Marcus wouldn't be protecting anyone else this hard, taking risks like this for anyone except family."
Agent Landry was already on her phone, coordinating arrests and search warrants with the kind of federal efficiency that local corruption couldn't deflect or delay. Within hours, teams would be moving simultaneously against both men, seizing evidence before it could be destroyed and preventing any coordination of their defense. But first, they needed to get Guidry to safety and prepare him for the testimony that would finally bring justice to Amelia Boudreaux and however many other victims had disappeared into the Louisiana swamps over the past 20 years. "Mr. Guidry," Landry said, "we're going to move you to a secure facility where you can recover while we prepare charges. But I need to ask, is there anything else you remember about that night in 2004? Any other details that might help us understand what happened?" The old fisherman closed his eyes, traveling back through 2 decades of carefully suppressed memories. When he opened them again, they were filled with the pain of someone who had carried guilt for too long. "There was something else in the water that night," he said quietly. "Something they threw in before they transferred whatever was in the department boat. Looked like a bag, weighted down with something heavy. Do you remember the location?"
"Could find it again if you need me to. That's my water out there. I know every tree, every sandbar, every place where the current runs deep enough to hide things you don't want found." If they could find what had been dumped that night, they might have the proof they needed to connect Dr. Thibodaux and his son to Amelia's murder. "We'll arrange for a dive team," Landry said, "but that's going to take time, and we need to move on the arrests before word gets out that we're closing in." As if summoned by her words, Isolde's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Where are you? Sheriff's looking for you. Says it's urgent." She showed the message to Landry, who nodded grimly. They know something's happening. Time to roll. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of coordinated federal action that swept through St. Martinville like a hurricane of justice long delayed. FBI agents arrested Dr. James Thibodaux at his medical practice, seizing patient records and computers while shocked staff watched their respected employer led away in handcuffs. Marcus was taken at his apartment, offering no resistance but maintaining his innocence even as agents read him his rights. Sheriff Boudreaux was arrested at his home, charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy in connection with the cover-up of Amelia's murder. His stunned wife watched from their front porch as federal agents searched the house that had been purchased with money that investigators would later discover came from payments for official silence. But the most shocking arrest came at dawn, when agents surrounded a hunting camp in the Atchafalaya Basin and found evidence of what prosecutors would later describe as a 20-year killing spree. The camp belonged to Dr. Thibodaux, but it had been used by him and his son as a private torture chamber where at least 6 young women had died over the past 2 decades. The victims had been carefully selected: runaways, addicts, women whose disappearances wouldn't attract official attention or sustained investigation. Amelia Boudreaux had been an exception, a victim chosen by opportunity rather than planning.
and her murder had required the massive cover-up that had protected the killers for so long. In the weeks that followed, as prosecutors built their case and defense attorneys scrambled to limit the damage, the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. Dr. Thibodaux had used his medical practice to identify vulnerable patients, women with drug problems or abusive relationships who wouldn't be missed immediately. He and Marcus had lured them to the hunting camp with promises of help or treatment, then satisfied their violent urges before disposing of the bodies in the vast wetlands where they would never be found. The sheriff and several other department members had been paid to look the other way, to redirect investigations and suppress evidence, to ensure that the killing could continue without official interference. It was a system of corruption so complete and so long-standing that it had become part of the institutional culture of St. Martin Parish law enforcement. Mrs. Evangeline Boudreaux was 81 when she finally learned the truth about her granddaughter's death. Isolde sat with her in the cafe that had been Amelia's favorite place, watching the old woman's hands shake as she held the final police report that contained details no grandmother should ever have to read. "All these years," she whispered, "I've been serving coffee to the man who killed my baby. Been asking about his family, been praying for his health when he got sick." Her voice broke with the weight of betrayal and lost time. "How does a person live with himself, knowing what he done?" "Some people don't have the conscience for guilt," Isolde said gently. "They see other people as things to be used rather than lives to be respected. And you? How you gonna live with this?" It was a question Isolde had been asking herself since the arrests began. She had solved the case, brought justice to Amelia and the other victims, exposed a conspiracy that had
corrupted an entire law enforcement agency. But she had also destroyed the career of a man she had considered a friend, had learned that her instincts about human nature were fallible, had discovered that evil could wear familiar faces and speak with trusted voices. "One day at a time," she said finally, "same as everybody else." The trials began 6 months later, drawing national media attention and transforming St. Martinville into a symbol of small-town corruption and the courage required to confront it. Dr. Thibodaux was sentenced to death for 6 counts of first-degree murder. Marcus received life without parole for his role in the killings and the torture of Titus Guidry. Sheriff Boudreaux and 3 other officers received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years for their roles in the conspiracy. The federal dive team had recovered the weighted bag that Titus Guidry remembered seeing thrown into the bayou 20 years earlier. Inside, perfectly preserved by the anaerobic conditions at the bottom of the swamp, were Amelia's personal effects, her jewelry, her driver's license, and most damning of all, a voice recorder she had been carrying that contained her final moments. The recording revealed that she had discovered Dr. Thibodaux's crimes through her work at a women's shelter and had arranged to meet with him to confront him about a missing patient. Instead of a confrontation, she had walked into a trap that cost her life. Isolde was promoted to Sheriff of St. Martin Parish in a special election that saw the highest voter turnout in the parish's history. At 38, she was the youngest sheriff in Louisiana and the first woman to hold the office in a region where tradition died hard and change came slowly. But the community that had once been suspicious of outsiders now embraced her as someone who had proven that justice mattered more than loyalty, that truth was worth the cost of disturbing comfortable lies. Titus Guidry recovered from his injuries and became something of a local hero, the fisherman who had risked everything to expose corruption that reached the highest levels of government. He used his newfound celebrity to establish a foundation that provided support for families of missing persons, ensuring that future disappearances would receive the attention and resources that had been denied to Amelia and the other victims.
The old sheriff's department was dissolved and rebuilt from the ground up, with new personnel trained in modern investigative techniques and federal oversight that would prevent the kind of institutional corruption that had flourished for 2 decades. It was painful medicine for a community that prized independence, but necessary surgery for an organization that had been rotten at its core. 3 years after the arrests, Mrs. Evangeline Boudreaux closed her cafe for the final time. At 84, she had decided that 40 years of serving coffee and beignets to the community was enough, that it was time to rest and let someone else carry the burden of feeding a town that gathered to share its joys and sorrows over meals prepared with love and seasoned with memory.
"You ever regret it?" Mrs. Evangeline asked, her voice still strong despite her age. "All the pain you caused, all the families you broke apart when you told the truth." "Every day," Isolde admitted. "But I regret more what would have happened if I hadn't. How many more girls would have died? How many more families would have lost their children to monsters who wore the faces of men they trusted?" "Amelia would have been 35 next month," the old woman said, her eyes focused on something beyond the present moment. "Might have had children of her own by now, might have been running this place, teaching my recipes for beignets and café au lait, sharing the stories that gave the place its soul, along with the practical knowledge needed to keep it running." "Change comes whether we want it or not," she said, watching the new owners direct the installation of their own equipment. "Question is whether we fight it or learn to dance with it." 5 years after the trials, Detective Catherine Broussard published a book about the case that became a national bestseller and was adapted into a television miniseries that brought renewed attention to issues of corruption in small-town law enforcement. The book was dedicated to Amelia Boudreaux and the other victims, but it also honored the courage of people like Titus Guidry and Isolde, who had risked everything to ensure that truth survived in a world where powerful people preferred comfortable lies. Broussard had left the state police to become a federal prosecutor specializing in cases involving official corruption, using the lessons learned in St. Martinville to dismantle similar conspiracies across the South. Her work had led to the conviction of dozens of corrupt officials and the implementation of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of institutional capture that had made the Boudreaux murders possible. Evil flourishes when good people decide that speaking up costs too much. But silence is never free. It's just a debt that gets passed on to the next generation with interest compounded by time and complicity. 7 years after becoming sheriff, Isolde stood at the podium of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia, addressing a class of law enforcement officers from around the world about the importance of maintaining integrity in the face of institutional pressure. Her case had become a textbook example of how corruption could be dismantled when investigators were willing to follow evidence wherever it led, regardless of the political consequences. "The badge doesn't make you righteous," she told the assembled officers. "It makes you responsible. Responsible for protecting people who can't protect themselves, for speaking for victims who can no longer speak, for choosing justice over comfort, even when that choice cost you everything you thought you wanted." In the audience, she spotted several officers from Louisiana parishes, men and women who represented a new generation of law enforcement, trained to value transparency over loyalty, accountability over tradition. They were the legacy of Amelia Boudreaux's death, proof the tragedy could be transformed into positive change if people were willing to learn from their failures and commit to doing better. 10 years after the arrests, the Amelia Boudreaux Memorial Garden was dedicated in the center of St. Martinville, where the old courthouse had once stood.
The garden featured native Louisiana plants, cypress trees and Spanish moss, wild irises and southern magnolias, arranged around a fountain that provided the sound of running water as a counterpoint to the traffic and conversation of daily life. A bronze plaque near the fountain bore Amelia's photograph and a simple inscription, "In memory of all who died in silence and in honor of those who refused to let silence have the final word." Isolde attended the dedication ceremony along with hundreds of community members who had learned to see their town's painful history as a foundation for building something better. Titus Gedry, now in his 80s but still sharp as a fishing hook, spoke about the importance of remembering the past while working towards a future where such tragedies became impossible.
"This garden ain't just about one girl who died too young," he told the crowd. "It's about all of us learning to see each other as human beings, deserving of protection and respect. It's about choosing truth over comfort, justice over convenience, love over fear." Mrs. Evangeline had died 2 years earlier, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86. Her funeral had filled the cathedral and spilled out into the streets, with people coming from across Louisiana to pay respects to a woman who had embodied grace under unimaginable pressure. She was buried next to her granddaughter in the old cemetery, their matching headstones facing east, toward the sunrise and the promise of resurrection. 15 years after solving the case that had defined her career, Isolde retired from law enforcement to become a professor at the LSU Criminal Justice Program, teaching future investigators about the complexities of small-town policing and the ethical challenges that arose when personal relationships conflicted with professional obligations. Her students were young and idealistic, full of energy and conviction that they could make the world better through dedication and hard work. She tried not to discourage their optimism while preparing them for the realities they would face: the political pressure, the bureaucratic obstacles, the moments when doing the right thing required sacrificing everything they had built. "Justice isn't a destination," she told them during her final lecture before retirement. "It's a practice. It's something you choose every day, in small moments and large ones, when no one is watching and when everyone is. It's the decision to see victims as people rather than case numbers, to follow evidence rather than assumptions, to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves." 20 years after Amelia Boudreaux's murder was finally solved, a new generation of St. Martinville residents gathered annually at the Memorial Garden to remember not just the victims, but the courage required to seek truth in the face of institutional resistance. The ceremony had grown from a small community gathering into a regional event that drew participants from across Louisiana, all united by the understanding that silence in the face of injustice was a choice that carried consequences for everyone. Among the speakers that year was Maria Santos, a young detective with the newly reformed St. Martin Parish Sheriff's Office, who had been inspired to enter law enforcement by Isolde's example. She spoke about the importance of learning from past failures while building systems that would prevent their repetition. The story of Amelia Boudreaux isn't just about one murder or one cover-up. It's about the choice between comfort and courage, between loyalty and justice, between the easy path of silence and the difficult road of speaking truth to power. Every day we face that choice. Every day we decide what kind of community we want to be. In the years that followed, the Boudreaux case became a cornerstone of criminal justice education, studied in law schools and police academies as an example of how corruption could flourish in the absence of oversight, and how truth could emerge when individuals were willing to sacrifice comfort for conscience. Detective Angela Tran,
who had helped Isolde copy the original case files, eventually became Sheriff of St. Martin Parish herself, continuing the reforms that had transformed the department from a symbol of corruption into a model of modern law enforcement. Under her leadership, the parish became a testing ground for new approaches to community policing, victim advocacy, and transparency in investigation. The hunting camp, where Dr. Thibodaux and his son had tortured and killed their victims, was demolished and turned into a wildlife preserve, with trails and observation areas that allowed visitors to experience the beauty of the Louisiana wetlands while remembering the darkness that had once flourished in the shadows. Educational signs along the trails told the story of the investigation and the importance of protecting vulnerable members of society. 25 years after the arrests, Isolde published her own memoir, an unflinching account of the investigation and its aftermath that became required reading for law enforcement officers throughout the South. She donated the proceeds to organizations that provided support for families of missing persons and training for investigators working cold cases.
Evil depends on good people believing they are powerless to stop it, she wrote in the book's final chapter. But power isn't something that's given to you. It's something you take when you decide that injustice is unacceptable and that someone has to stand up and say no more. Sometimes that someone is a detective with 20 years of experience and federal resources at her disposal. Sometimes it's an old fisherman who decides that keeping silent makes him complicit in murder. Sometimes it's a grandmother who refuses to let her granddaughter be forgotten. The book's final paragraph became something of a rallying cry for investigators around the world. Amelia Boudreaux died because people who should have protected her chose comfort over courage. She received justice because other people chose differently. Every day we face that choice. Every day we decide whether silence or truth will have the final word. Choose truth. Choose courage. Choose to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. 30 years after the case was solved, the city of St. Martinville hosted an international conference on combating corruption in law enforcement, drawing participants from 6 continents to share strategies and learn from each other's experiences. The conference was held in the Amelia Boudreaux Justice Center, a modern facility that housed the sheriff's office, courthouse, and training academy that prepared the next generation of law enforcement officers. The center's lobby featured a permanent exhibit about the case, including artifacts from the investigation, testimony from survivors and family members, and interactive displays that allowed visitors to understand the complexities of corruption and the courage required to confront it. School groups toured the exhibit regularly, learning about the importance of speaking up when they witnessed injustice, regardless of their age or position in society. Among the conference speakers was Dr. James Rodriguez, a criminologist who had spent decades studying the Boudreaux case and its impact on law enforcement reform. His research had identified dozens of similar cases across the United States where institutional corruption had protected serial killers, and his work had led to new federal oversight mechanisms designed to prevent such failures. The St. Martinville case represents both the worst and the best of American law enforcement. It shows how corruption can flourish when institutions value loyalty over justice, when personal relationships take precedence over professional obligations. But it also demonstrates the power of individuals to change systems, to transform tragedy into progress, to ensure that the dead are not forgotten and the living are protected. As the conference concluded, participants walked through the memorial garden where Amelia's fountain continued to provide the sound of running water, a reminder that truth, like water, has a way of finding its path around obstacles that seem immovable. The bronze plaque had weathered 30 years of Louisiana sun and rain, but the words remained clear and strong. In memory of all who died in silence, and in honor of those who refused to let silence have the final word.
In the distance, the bells of St. Martin de Tours Catholic Church chimed the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the same town where Amelia Boudreaux had once sung in the choir, where she had lived and laughed and dreamed of a future that was stolen from her by monsters who wore familiar faces. But her death had not been in vain. It had become the foundation for a different kind of future, one where truth mattered more than comfort, where justice was worth whatever price it demanded.
And in law enforcement academies around the world, instructors continued to tell her story to new generations of officers, reminding them that the badge was not a shield against accountability, but a responsibility to serve something greater than themselves. They learned about Isolde Maren, the detective who refused to accept comfortable lies. They studied Titus Goudry, the fisherman who chose courage over safety. They remembered Mrs. Evangeline Boudreaux, the grandmother who never stopped believing that truth would eventually emerge from the swamp of secrets that had swallowed her granddaughter. The case files were digitized and preserved in the FBI's National Archives, available to researchers and investigators who needed to understand how corruption could be identified, confronted, and dismantled. The evidence, including the voice recording that captured Amelia's final moments, served as a permanent reminder that victims deserved more than sympathy. They deserved justice, no matter how long it took to achieve. And in St. Martinville, where Spanish moss still draped the ancient oak trees and the bayou still carried the whispers of generations past, children grew up learning a different story than their parents had known. They learned that speaking truth to power was not just a responsibility, but a privilege, that living in a just society required the active participation of every citizen, that silence in the face of evil was not neutrality, but complicity. The story of Amelia Boudreaux had become more than the account of one young woman's murder and the investigation that finally brought her justice. It had become a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of courage, and the truth that no darkness is so complete that it cannot be pierced by those willing to carry the light. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.